Good afternoon. I'd like to thank JDIP for asking me to speak on sedation and awareness. If you weren't put to sleep by lunch, you probably will be after this. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to whoever possibly can find my mobile phone, which has gone missing. So if you counter a black iPhone 4, it's mine. So this is going to be a pretty rapid canter through the findings of NAP5 in relation to sedation. You've already had an explanation of why we decided to include those cases. Here's what the comedian David Sedaris experienced during colonoscopy, and I should emphasize this was not in NAP5. So always worthwhile to listen to him speaking. And I think we can all say that was pretty much oblivion. This is perhaps not quite so good. This is a vignette from NAP5. So, this is the take-home message, a distillation of the findings. So if there's no more time, I can sit down now. Or do you want me to carry on? Okay, all right, I'll carry on. So that really is it. People's experiences vary, but their expectations don't. The long-term sequelae, although slightly less severe than awareness following general anaesthesia, are similar, and we need to manage patient expectations. So these are the numbers. About 1 in 5, there were 32 cases of the 141 Class A and B reports which related to sedation, which gives a frequency using the AAS data of about 1 in 15,000, which I felt is pretty comparable to the 1 in 20,000 for anaesthesia. The majority were during the procedure rather than during induction, which is fairly obvious. 1 was in recovery, and half of the reports were received within a day of the procedure. The rest were delayed by weeks, months, or in one case, 22 years. There were an overwhelming proportion of women, 22 women, 10 men, and 1 woman reported the same experience after successive surgery of the same type. Only 12 of the reports, about just over a third, where the sedation was given by non-anaesthetists, and all but 6 reports were deemed to be caused by failure of communication. So this is the patient experience. We've got one unusual patient who has both paralysis and pain with distress following this experience, but the majority of patients only had auditory or tactile symptoms. But this didn't prevent them from being traumatic. So purely because there was no pain or no distress at the time, it didn't stop it from being traumatic. And only 1 patient reporting paralysis is unusual because, as we'll see, or as has been seen, when Kent and al. Did a study in 2013, they reported about 25% of their patients experiencing paralysis during sedation and 40% experiencing paralysis and pain. So we're slightly at odds with them. But she thought that it was mainly because of the use of straps and buckles and heavy drapes and pressure from the surgeons, which perhaps we don't use to the same extent here. This is the outcome, and we can see that there was a significant number of patients who had long-lasting, moderate or severe effects from their experience. About 30% of patients experienced them compared to 40-odd after awareness in anaesthesia. So the causes, essentially they boil down to 2 things. Either a failure to communicate what level of consciousness was intended, or dissatisfaction on the patient's behalf of the level of consciousness that was actually attained. So whether the communication errors lie with the transmitter or the receiver is not really established, but several patients specifically reported they'd been told they'd be asleep, would receive light anaesthesia, whereas others had signed consent which were explicit about the planned or intended level of consciousness. So going back to the published literature, is it unusual? Well, no, it's not new. So these 3 studies, all fairly recent, show a wide range of results. Ours is closer to the higher end here. So what do patients want from sedation? Well, Isaki's study in 2009 looked at what patients expected, and about a third of patients expected oblivion. But only half of them got this from their anaesthetist. And their expectations are therefore not necessarily going to be met, no matter how skillfully you give the sedation. So the source of the information, I'm sorry if it doesn't project very well, but just under 60% came from the anaesthesia provider, anaesthetist or anaesthetic nurse, this being in the States. 25% from their own personal assumptions about what it meant. About 15% from nursing staff and 10% from the surgeons. Other smaller numbers from other areas, or they didn't know or didn't remember. So the question, will I be a sleep doctor for a patient who's going to receive sedation, is difficult to answer because sedation itself is pretty poorly understood. We all have an idea personally what's meant by this term, but the definitions don't only vary with context, but they've also changed over time. There's no colloquial or agreed definition of sedation which is accessible to patients. The online Oxford Dictionary for this year defines sedation as a verb of action, that of allaying, assuaging or making calm or quiet. Wikipedia, which is often used by people who are interested in finding out something that they may not be familiar with, suggests reduction of irritability or agitation to facilitate a medical procedure. Older dictionaries, going back to the 1950s, such as the shorter Oxford, suggest the alleviation of pain is part of sedation. And the report of the Academy of Royal Colleges in 2012, I think, suggested it was a drug-induced depression of consciousness, part of the continuum culminating in general anaesthesia. So people may struggle to understand what this actually means, and the trouble is that there's a variability of drug effect both between individuals and within the same individual over time, and there's also variability of surgical stimulus. So we don't actually know at what depth of sedation any particular patient is going to be at any particular time, and that's why experiences can be so very, very varied between patients. What's almost certain, though, is that if we just present information about sedation an hour or so before the intended procedure, the patient's very unlikely to either be able to retain, process, or assimilate that information in a meaningful manner. And for this reason, we make the following recommendations. Sorry, I think I missed it. Right, okay, there we go. That patients will need written information well in advance, and this should emphasise the nature of sedation, what the aims are, the fact that sedation is not a general anaesthetic, and the likelihood that patients may well be aware of what's going on around them. This needs to be reinforced verbally on the day of surgery, and the experience should be explained from a patient's perspective. And these explanations should be realistic and shouldn't raise expectations that cannot be fulfilled. And there are similar conclusions in previous studies on sedation and awareness. It should be said, we're not the first people to have drawn these conclusions. So this is an abridged version of a table that appears in the report. And it looks at, this is almost entirely Mike Fury's work, this table. And it really looks at it from the patient point of view as opposed to the practitioner point of view. So what will you actually experience or feel, in these different states of sedation? So you probably won't be able to read the bits at the bottom of the screen, but it starts off as it is a continuum, and it explains the sort of varied states. So finally, just in case we thought that sedation is not that close to all of us, we should look no further than the college coat of arms. Right, there you go. It's divine or praiseworthy to alleviate pain. Thank you very much.